Frontier, The Story of an Accursed Era, by Thunderhawk. Chapter 1, An Introductory Anecdote. The sun beat down upon a dry, barren expanse of sand and dry grass. Massive, building-sized rocks were peppered around. They were like massive, unmoving titans to anyone who stood before them. Wedged between two of these rocks was a massive ship, the Avalon. Once a great warship, it was now suspended in the air between the two stony titans. At the front edge of its hull stood the ship's two current residents, Jones and Quentin. Quentin was a tall, somewhat lanky gentleman in his mid-20s. He was quite fancifully dressed with a bow tie and golden spectacles. Atop his head was a tall, purple top hat with tufts of silvery white hair poking out from underneath it. What was most striking about him, however, were his two massive bat wings, which sprung up from his back. They were no doubt large enough to carry him, and certainly quickly. Jones, his young apprentice, stood beside him. He was just over 11 years old, and not nearly as tidy as Quentin. He wore a loose tank top and a big raccoon hat atop his head of messy brown hair. "Right, let's get going," Quentin said. Jones nodded in agreement and jumped on Quentin's back. Quentin stepped up on the side railing and dove down off the side of the ship as his wings began to beat heavily, quickly taking flight. They were heading into town to pick up some food and such. They felt the wind on their face and the sun on their backs as Quentin soared through the sky. They left the rocky area and entered the vast plains, which were just as dry and dusty as everywhere else. The two were used to it by now. They'd gone to Redwick to pick up groceries before. The odd thing was, however, unlike their other trips, on this trip they would take a little detour. It was about 10 minutes into their 20-minute flight that they spotted someone on the ground below. It wasn't a traveler or anything. They looked to be a child, unconscious on the ground. "Who do you think that is?" Jones asked. "I don't know," Quentin replied. "Let's go investigate." He swooped down to examine the child, gently setting Jones down beside him. Upon further inspection, the child was a little girl with a mop of pitch-black hair. Her body was adorned in nothing but ripped, raggedy clothes, and surely enough, she was unconscious. "Strange." Quentin stroked his chin in wonder. "What's a little girl doing way out here? Maybe she got lost?" Jones suggested. "Perhaps." Quentin looked around. "I certainly don't see any parents around here. Let's take her into town. No matter who she is, I doubt it would be good to just leave her here." "Yeah," Jones agreed, hopping back on Quentin's back. Quentin picked up the girl and took flight once more, carrying her into town. Redwick was a small city built around a massive cliff, which stuck up from the ground. Most of the city was built around the steep base of the cliff, while a few buildings, such as the air dock and the observatory, were built at the top. Hot air balloons and maybe an airship or two could be seen drifting far above the city. Quentin swooped down into the town square. The statue of him stood in the center of the square, its plaque reading, "Quentin Graysville, Hero of Redwick." Putting down Jones, Quentin looked at the statue for a moment and continued on. With Jones following close behind, he brought the girl to the town hall. Quentin came to the front desk.
"Oh, Quentin," the receptionist said. "How are you doing today?"
"Oh, I'm fine, but we found this little girl out in the wilderness," Quentin replied. "Do you think we could get some people to try and find the parents?"
"Oh, certainly,"
the receptionist replied. "Okay, good." Quentin brought the little girl over to one of the waiting benches and laid her down, putting her head on his lap. Jones sat at the other side of the bench. Click, click. Quentin looked over to see Jones lighting a cigar. "Don't get comfortable, there's still shopping to be done," Quentin retorted. "Here's the list and some buckles. Go pick up the groceries, will you?" He handed Jones the shopping list and the money. He got up and grumbled as he walked out to go do the shopping. Quentin looked down at the sleeping girl below him. He had no idea who she was, but even so, he couldn't help but feel protective of her. He then noticed a bit of movement. Her eyes began to flutter and open slowly. Her first sight was the winged, top-hat man staring down at her. She jolted up and shuffled over to the other side of the bench. Her eyes were wide and she was trembling with fear. Quentin was a bit surprised as well. "Hello?" Quentin asked. The girl didn't respond. She looked too shaken up. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," Quentin said. "I'm Quentin. What's your name?" The girl looked very reluctant to speak, but eventually she let out a pitiful little voice. Karaite, she muttered. "Well, Karaite, what were you doing all alone in the wilderness?" Quentin asked. I don't know," she replied. "Do you know where your parents are?" Quentin asked. No," Karaite replied again. Quentin stroked his chin. "Well, I promise we'll find them for you." Karaite nodded gently. The receptionist noticed that they were talking and glanced up at them. She didn't intervene in their conversation, though. In the meantime, Quentin reached into his bag and took out a little scanning device with a long, thermometer-like end. "We'll check to see if you have any infections. Here, put this in your mouth." Okay." Karaite obliged and stuck the thermometer end between her lips. After a moment, the little screen on the scanner lit up and let out a beep. "Alrighty." Quentin popped the scanner out of her mouth and looked at the little screen. "Let's see here. You certainly seem malnutritioned and a bit dehydrated. Other than that, it doesn't seem..." Quentin's face turned pale with horror as he saw the last piece of information on the scanner. "What is it?" Karaite asked fearfully. Oh, nothing." Quentin spoke nervously, sweat beading up on his skin. "Just a little infection, that's all. Here, take this pill." He took out a box of blue pills. There only seemed to be a few left. Karaite swallowed the pill without any fuss. "Alright, let's see here." Quentin popped the scanner back in her mouth. It beeped again, and he looked at the results. He took a sigh of relief. "You're fine now," Quentin said. Inside, however, he was thinking, "At least it's suppressed for now, but how the hell is that even possible?" Karaite's stomach let out a bottomless growl. Wincing, she clutched her belly in hunger. "Oh, right, you're hungry." Quentin reached into his bag and procured a wrapped chocolate bar. "This is all I have on me, but it should do for now." Karaite took it and began to gnaw on it. To her surprise, it didn't taste very good without the wrapping taken off. She looked at it confused. "No, silly, you have to open it first." Quentin tore the wrapping off and handed her the chocolate. She looked at it somewhat floored, before taking a bite out of the chocolate. As soon as it touched her tongue, the sugar hit her like a train engine. She was immediately awestruck by it. Her eyes widened as the gooey chocolate began to melt between her teeth. It was like she'd never had something like this before in her life. She immediately wolfed the whole chocolate bar down without hesitation. Quentin laughed. "You like it, huh?" Karaite gave Quentin a big, chocolate-covered smile and nodded her head quickly. "You must also be thirsty, too." Quentin pulled out his canteen. "I was saving this for the trip home, but you can have it if you need." He popped it open and handed it to Karaite. She took a look inside of it and gasped, realizing what it was. She stuffed the canteen to her lips and began gulping down all of Quentin's water. He obviously didn't mind, and it seemed like she hadn't seen that much water in ages. Upon finishing the last drop, Karaite pulled the canteen from her mouth and let out an enormous burp. Quentin laughed again. Karaite gave a big smile. They sat there for about an hour. Quentin kept asking her questions, but he couldn't get any real answers out of her. She did seem a bit more okay with his presence now, though. It was probably the chocolate. Either way, Jones returned soon enough with a bunch of paper shopping bags. "Here's the groceries." Jones plopped the bags next to the bench and sat down. "Thank you," Quentin replied. Jones took a puff of his cigar and blew it out. Karaite began to cough at the smoke. "Hey, put that out," Quentin said. "Karaite doesn't have special lungs like you." Jones rolled his eyes and put it out on the bench. "Don't you roll your eyes at me, mister." Quentin took a harsh tone. "Look, I'm sorry about the smoke or whatever, okay?" Jones said. "Besides, I didn't know this little squirt had a name. Karaite, you said?" He turned to look at her. Karaite seemed nervous of Jones's presence. "Yes, and from how hungry and thirsty she was, I'd say she's already had a bad enough day without you pushing smoke into her lungs," Quentin said. "Oh, that reminds me. Now that the groceries are here, Karaite, I can actually give you something more than just a chocolate bar." Karaite perked up as Quentin began rooting through the grocery bags. Jones crossed his arms and began looking out the window. "Let me see here. We've got some bread and cheese and... Oh, is this roast beef?" Quentin said. "Hey, don't touch my roast beef. I got that for me," Jones butted in. "Do you mind if Karaite has some?" Quentin asked. "I'm sure she's still very hungry." Karaite's stomach began to growl. Jones looked over to her. She was giving him puppy dog eyes through the wince on her face. Jones didn't want to give any of it away, but... "Fine, she can have some, but only for one sandwich, okay?" "Oh, thank you." Quentin began cobbling together a cheese and roast beef sandwich with the groceries and eventually handed it over to Karaite. In an instant, it was all already in her mouth. "The officers we sent earlier haven't found anyone in town who's missing their kid," the receptionist said to them. "The orphanages aren't missing any kids either. Whoever the parents are, they don't live in Redwick." "Wait, you don't live here?" Quentin asked Karaite. "No," she responded. "Then where do you live?" he asked. I don't know," she said. "Is it like a town or a city or a nomad group?" Quentin continued to ask. "No, I just live everywhere, I guess," she replied. "You've just been living out in the wilderness?" Quentin asked. I guess. With your parents?" "No, I've just been alone." "You've been living by yourself in the wilderness?" Quentin shouted. "No wonder you're so hungry." He gave her a big hug and went over to the receptionist. "Mark it down that I'm adopting another kid," Quentin told her. "Well, it's a bit more complicated than that," the receptionist said, "but I'll see what I can do." "She better not be getting my bed," Jones said. Karaite came back home to the Avalon with them that evening. Of course, she ended up getting Jones's bed. He would never get over that. It was soon that Quentin was buying her new clothes and making her stuffed little toys to play with. She didn't have a birth certificate, so it was hard to tell when her birthday was, or even how old she was. Quentin was pretty sure she was around 8 years old, but it was still uncertain. He also decided that because she didn't have an official birthday, the date of the day they found her would be her new birthday. All of this sudden attention and positivity was almost too overwhelming for Karaite. For someone accustomed to living on her own in the wilderness, suddenly having a parental figure was weird for her. That's not to say it didn't make her happy, but it certainly threw her through a loop. Quentin was also certain that she had some sort of pre-existing parental figure in her life, because she already knew how to speak. She said she thinks she had a mother caring for her at one point, but she couldn't really remember anything other than that. Karaite's arrival was a weird experience for Jones as well. Suddenly, he was no longer always the center of attention. In fact, it seemed like Karaite was getting significantly more attention than him. It quickly became annoying to him. He began to lash out in subtle ways. The first and most obvious manifestation of this was his constant teasing of her. He would come to find profound joy in harassing her while Quentin wasn't around. Karaite would obviously always go and tell Quentin about it, which ended in quite a few more arguments between he and Jones than how it was before. He also began smoking more, although his lungs were built for it, so it wasn't that big of a deal. It was a few weeks in that Karaite first began to see a different side of Quentin. It wasn't necessarily bad, but it was certainly different than the very nice and calm person he usually was. They were out in the Redwick Bazaar, looking at the various trinkets and wares on display. Karaite would always be able to remember it vividly. She was looking at a few rings that were up for sale. She really liked how they looked, but they were being sold for several hundred buckles each. Quentin definitely wasn't going to buy her any of them. It was a nice thought, though. It was in that moment, as she was gazing at those rings, that she suddenly felt someone grab her arm. Before she knew it, she was off the ground in a tight, inescapable hold. The stranger that grabbed her began running off with her. She couldn't see his face and had no idea what was going on. She began to panic and called for Quentin as loud as she could. It was in that moment that Quentin unfurled the whip at his belt. It was long, black, and had a cup-like hilt on the handle. Quentin swiftly leapt from the ground and flew upwards, his wings beating powerfully in the wind. Karaite saw him in the sky. It was like a specter of death gazing down upon the man trying to run off with her. Beneath that pair of golden spectacles was the fiery rage of 1,000 demons ready to descend upon the man. He was lightning fast, bolting straight into the stranger's back. The sheer force of Quentin reaming into him made him drop Karaite and scream. Quentin grabbed him by the collar and tossed him up in the air. "Go! Storm Viper!" Quentin called out as he quickly went above him midair and snapped his whip back in preparation for a strike. "Thunder crack!" Quentin yelled as he brought down a godlike fury upon the man with a single midair strike. A massive boom and flash of light rung forth as the whip belted across the man's body. The man was shot down to the ground from the powerful hit, creating a small crater in the ground where he landed. Quentin rushed to Karaite, his face now washed with concern. "Are you okay, honey?" Karaite was completely speechless. She had just seen her new foster dad bring down the fury of heaven upon this man who tried to kidnap her. It was beyond surprising. It was from that point forward that Karaite began to learn more and more about Quentin's profession. He was a special ops officer in Redwick, and certainly the most skilled one at that. With his flight and special whip, he was able to take down criminals that were too much to handle for the military police. Everyone knew him as the hero of Redwick. It did seem a bit odd to Karaite that seemingly everyone knew who he was and that he had a statue in the middle of town square. Speaking of that, she definitely asked about that. Quentin informed her that it was built in his honor after he saved Redwick from a group of warlords known as the Desolators, who almost destroyed the entire city. She was amazed by all his stories. Her new dad was certainly cool. All she could do was be in awe of him. It was about 2 months into her stay with Quentin that Karaite began to go with school with Jones. She didn't really like the idea. She would be away from Quentin for 6 hours a day, and she would have to be with Jones, who was still privy to constantly teasing her. She hadn't gone to town much at that point, so she hadn't seen that many people before. However, when she first saw all of her classmates, they seemed very strange. One of them had 3 eyes, another had horns and a tail, and another had an extra set of arms. A little less than half the class had some sort of strange trait like this, but they were all just acting like it was normal. It freaked her out. The rest of her first day was equally as scary. The teacher handed pieces of paper with weird symbols on them that she had never seen before. The teacher quickly realized that Karaite didn't know how to read. She was sent to the special needs class. Out in the courtyard during lunch, Karaite was sitting by herself eating the sandwich that Quentin packed for her that morning. She was so nervous and embarrassed. It was all so frightening to her. It was then that one of the other kids came up on the other side of the table. She had a hot pink dress and obnoxiously large sunglasses on, and behind her, a boy with white bird wings was floating a few feet off the ground. "Look, Charlie, that's the new girl who doesn't know how to read." She let out the most annoying laugh in the world as the boy behind her began to snicker. Karaite looked down in embarrassment and her eyes began to well up. "The hell'd you say, you little shit?" A voice came from behind the two. Jones stood there, smoking a cigar as usual. His expression was slightly pissed off. Virginia, isn't that Quentin's kid?" Charlie whispered. "I heard he beat up kids 3 years older than him just for looking at him wrong," she whispered back. "Well?" Jones said. "Oh, nothing," Virginia said. "We were just on our way." The two quickly got out of there. Jones sat down next to Karaite with his own bagged lunch. "You okay?" Jones asked, unfurling his lunch bag. "Yeah," Karaite muttered. "Well, if anyone else makes fun of you, you let me know," Jones said, "'cause the only person allowed to make fun of you is me." Karaite giggled a bit. "What?" Jones asked. "Oh, nothing. Karaite's nearly tearful face now had a bit of a smile. She began eating her lunch again and leaned her head up against Jones. He pretended like he didn't notice and just went about eating his lunch like normal. After that day, Jones began to tease Karaite less and less, and she continued going to school each day. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and months eventually became years. Karaite got used to living with Quentin and Jones. It was the happiest she'd been in who knows how long. She eventually did learn how to read and would eventually come to catch up with the other kids of her age education-wise. About 2 years after she was adopted, after she had her 10th birthday, Quentin began giving Karaite self-defense lessons, just like he did with Jones. Even if she wanted to go with a non-combative profession, it certainly wouldn't hurt. Luckily, she was very adept at it. Learning self-defense seemed to come much more naturally to her than formal academics. By the age of 12, she was determined to become a military police officer when she grew up, just like Quentin. She continued to do her combat training with him. It became more and more vigorous as she became better and better. Eventually, her 14th birthday came. Quentin brought her to a junkyard late that afternoon. They came to a run-down brick wall in the middle of the yard. "Alright, Karaite," Quentin said. "Now that you're 14, there's something I'd like to show you." "Mm-hmm." He unfurled his whip before her eyes. "My whip, Storm Viper," he said. "Ethereally chanted and very powerful. I know you've seen it in action many times before. Today is the day that it becomes yours." "Wait, for real?" Karaite was amazed. You're giving it to me?" "Yes, you've proven that you're more than worthy of having it," he said. "It's about time you get a special weapon of your own anyway." "But what will you use?" she asked. "Oh, it's not a big deal. It'll take some time, but I can make a new whip for myself," he replied. "Don't worry about that. Right now, instead, I need you to focus, because I'm going to teach you how to use this whip." Karaite became giddy. She looked up to Quentin so much, and now she was going to be just like him. "Okay, observe closely." Quentin stretched out the whip between his hands for Karaite to see. "First, in order to activate it, you say its command phrase. Go, Storm Viper!" As he said those words, the thong of the whip began to crackle with electricity. Whoa! Karaite gazed upon the spikes of lightning coming off from it. "Then," Quentin continued, "using proper form and the right command word, you gain access to its abilities. Like so." Quentin got in front of the brick wall and positioned himself just right as Karaite watched from a distance. "Thunder!" He brought the whip back, preparing to strike at just the right angle. Crack! The end of the whip smacked against the brick wall with such immense force that it exploded into tiny pieces. Karaite could feel the shockwave of the strike even from far away. Quentin brought it back. The entire brick wall was left a pile of rubble with a single blow. "Holy shit," Karaite muttered to herself. She had seen it multiple times before, but it never ceased to amaze her. "Now you try," Quentin encouraged her. From that day forward, he began teaching her the proper form and various abilities of Storm Viper. She got the hang of it quite quickly. Eventually, she would become just as good with it as Quentin. It was also around that time that Karaite and Jones were getting far too big for him to carry into town every day. Jones was already about to turn 17, so he was getting pretty close to being a real adult. Quentin decided to buy them a Jolly. Jones started taking up driving lessons and would have his license by the time he turned 18. Quentin also rigged up a pulley-based lift from the Avalon to the ground, so they would be able to get up to it without needing him to fly them up there. It didn't take long for Jones to apply to become a special operative alongside Quentin, and he passed with flying colors. With his apprenticeship with Quentin and his rare ability to smoke wield, he had no trouble taking an elite position in the military police. Now having the lightning whip Storm Viper and also being trained by Quentin, Karaite was on track to becoming a special operative as well. By her 16th birthday, Karaite had also taken up driving lessons. By 17, she had her license, and by 18, she was done with school and applied to join the Spec Ops, even exceeding Jones's score when he took the test. By now, Karaite was no longer the scared little girl she was 10 years ago. She was one of the most well-trained military officers in the city and had gotten the self-confidence to stand up for herself in tense situations. The three worked alongside each other. Quentin, Jones, and Karaite were a powerful trio that every criminal and warlord in the area would learn to fear. Everyone knew their names and faces. Even outside of Redwick, merchants and travelers who had seen them told the tales of their heroism. They were pretty famous, relatively at least. Even without the newfound acclamation, the three still found happiness with each other. They hung out at diners, played poker, and just spent a lot of time together, when they weren't on the job at least. Not shortly after Karaite turned 20, Quentin would receive a call in the middle of the night. He picked up the receiver of the radio phone and answered. "Hello?" "Quentin, it's me, Cyrus," the voice on the line answered. "We need you for another mission." Quentin's face immediately became serious, and he spoke in a hushed tone. "Look, I know it's been a while, and I would love to catch up sometime, Cyrus. But there's a reason I left the API. You know better than anybody what I've seen." "I know that," Cyrus replied. "I never planned on calling you for a mission again, but this time it's different. Siphon is back. We've been tracking her to the northern half of the frontier, where you are." "Siphon?" Quentin became shaken up. Quentin, we need you now more than ever," Cyrus said. "The effort to recruit new members has been a complete failure. We need someone with experience and history, like you. Please." Quentin breathed for a moment. "I don't want to do this. I'm not just scared anymore. I have 2 children. I'm the protector of an entire city. However, if you truly need me, I'll be there." "I really can't express how thankful I am. We need you, Quentin," Cyrus replied. "I'll be passing through Mirabet in a few days. We can meet up there." "Sounds like a plan." Quentin put down the receiver and ended the call. That night would be the first time he had alcohol in 20 years. The following day, Quentin would begin packing up. He told Jones and Karaite that he had very important business to attend to. He would say farewell to them at noon. This came as a surprise to both of them. Quentin was leaving? It was something that they hadn't even thought about before. Noon came and they said goodbye on the deck of the Avalon. "I promise I'll be back in no more than half a year," Quentin said. "It's just a friend of mine. He needs help with something going on. I promise I'll explain when I get back." Karaite was teary-eyed. "I promise we'll keep the city safe while you're gone, right, Jones?" "Oh, yeah, sure." Jones was lighting a cigar. "Can't you show some more concern?" Karaite scolded Jones. Quentin laughed. "It's fine, it's not like I'm going to be gone forever." Karaite sighed. "Well, yeah, it's just really sudden is all." "It'll be fine," Quentin gave her a hug. "Jones, get in here." He grumbled and joined in on the hug. Quentin squeezed the two of them tightly until their lungs were nearly out of breath. He let go. "Oh, and one last thing." He pulled out a small vial of glowing blue liquid. "If you ever get into a dire emergency," Quentin explained, "like if one of you is about to die or something, then Karaite should drink this." "What is it?" Karaite asked. "Oh, well, it's just a little something that'll save you in a pinch," Quentin said. "But only drink it in an emergency, okay?" "Alright." Karaite took the vial. "I love you guys. I promise I'll be back in half a year." They began to fly into the air. "Bye!" Karaite called out a teary goodbye. Jones took the cigar out of his mouth. "See ya." 2 years had passed since that day. The two were driving home from their day in town. It was mid-evening. The sun was setting in the distance, leaving a nice reddish-purple hue in the sky. As she was driving the Jolly, Karaite began reminiscing about that day 2 years ago. "Man, it's been so long," she said. "Do you think Quentin is okay?" From the passenger side, Jones let the smoke from his cigar out the window. "I'm sure he's fine.
Whatever business he's doing is probably just taking him longer than he thought. I mean, it's Quentin we're talking about.
I guess you're right, Karaite said. I just can't help but miss him. I really do hope he's alright.
Don't worry, I'm sure he'll be back any day now, Jones replied. Whoa, holy shit, do you see that flower?
Jones pointed out the window with excitement. What? Karaite was confused.
Whoa, wait, stop the jolly, I gotta take a closer look at this, Jones said.
Karaite stopped the vehicle so he could get out. He immediately rushed over to a spot a little ways away. Karaite got out too and followed closely behind him.
You seeing this?
Jones squatted down to a large multicolor flower. It was about 2 feet tall and brimming with vibrant hues. Yes, I see the flower. Karaite caught up. I mean, it's cool, but there's no reason to freak out about it.
What are you talking about? Look at this thing.
He plucked the flower up from the ground.
This is cool as hell.
Karaite crossed her arms with an amused smile. You obsess over the weirdest things.
Whatever.
Jones put the flower in his bag.
You just aren't savvy enough to understand the beauty of exotic agriculture.
The ground suddenly began to rumble. What's that? Karaite got tense.
Oh, I'm sure it's...
Jones was cut off as the ground quickly opened up beneath him, massive, spear-like teeth protruding from the edge of the newly made hole. Underneath Jones was the infamous Wandering Maw. Without a moment to react, he fell. Karaite immediately jumped in after him, screaming. Jones grabbed Karaite's leg as she slung Storm Viper from her hip and whipped it upwards, just barely grabbing onto one of the Maw's teeth. She breathed a sigh of relief. Then suddenly, the Maw began to close. Jones, it's closing! Karaite yelled frantically.
Welp, time for a smoke then.
Jones, calmly hanging from her leg, lit a cigar.
Smoky jet!
He yelled before sucking in the smoke from the cigar. His chest puffed up as he held it in for a moment. Then he pointed his lips down and blew forth. The two flew upwards as a cloud of smoke shot out of Jones's mouth like a powerful jet. They shot through the mouth of the Maw right before it could close in on them, and Karaite's whip released its grip on the tooth. They landed about 10 feet away as the giant underground worm known as the Wandering Maw slipped back down into the depths to go somewhere else. Holy shit, that was close! Karaite was shaken up. What are you talking about? We were fine. Jones took another puff of his cigar. We could have died, Karaite said.
Well, maybe you would have if I wasn't there to save you, Jones replied.
Karaite gave him a sarcastic look. Right. Well, either way, we're not stopping again for weird-looking plants. She began walking to the jolly.
Okay, but what if there's a really cool-looking plant?
Jones followed her. I said no. Karaite got into the passenger seat.
Fine, but if we miss something really cool, I'm gonna be pissed.
Jones got into the passenger seat. Yeah, I know. Karaite pushed the gas pedal and began driving the rest of the way home. If you enjoyed Chapter 1 of Frontier, make sure to like and maybe even leave a little subscribe for your boy. Chapter 2 will be coming in about 2 weeks, so stay tuned.